you'll leave with something, right? I don't know exactly what, but something. Thank you all for being here. Thank you especially for the gentleman from SC. I have a very good friend of mine from Boyle Heights. No. He literally said, I love you, Gustavo, but I love USC more. I know. That's why I told him, but no. He's like, I just see it more. Anyways, go Bruins. Don't worry, you guys are, it seems like you guys are going to have a better season than us. Nosotros, like, which happens every year, of course. Anyways, my name is Gustavo Arellano. Allow me to say a couple of things about myself, because I always tell people, if you have a captive audience in front of you, talk about all the amazing, or things that you think are amazing, things you do, because you never know when you'll have an audience in front of you again. Are you Facebook Living it, or Periscoping it, or what are you doing? It's all good, don't get me wrong. I just want to know so I can share it myself.
YouTube.
YouTube. I'm on Facebook Live it, why not, right? Anyways, yeah, don't think I'm like, you can't do that or anything like that. More, I say. Okay, so let me tell you a couple things. So I'm the editor of the OC Weekly. The OC Weekly is a free newspaper down in Orange County. We used to be related to LA Weekly, now we're not. Now I can say a lot of things about LA Weekly, but that's a whole other conversation. But our newspaper, we've always been different from LA Weekly and other papers like that. We have a mantra, our motto really is we comfort the afflicted and we afflict the comfortable. So in other words, we celebrate everything that's wonderful and amazing about Orange County. And yes, there are good things about Orange County, believe it or not. We tell you where all the great bands are, all the great artists, all the great restaurants, all the great activists, all the great history, cities, neighborhoods, all of that stuff. We love to celebrate that. But we also like to go after the bad guys. Our newspaper is notorious. Let's see. We've freed at least 5 innocent people, so people who are wrongfully in prison, we freed those. We've gotten a hell of a lot of bad people in jail. Our most famous accomplishment, we got our former sheriff, like I know your sheriff, Lee Baca, is going to prison. Well, we put our sheriff in prison first, Mike Corona. We put him in federal prison for 6 years. We've ruined the lives of many politicians, many businessmen, people who deserve their lives to be ruined. We did that. Just recently, yesterday, the 9th District Court of Appeal, they overturned a conviction on a guy that we wrote about who was wrongfully convicted as well. So we keep doing that stuff. Even this day and age where people say journalism is dead, journalism isn't dead to us. We're going to continue doing all that. So I'm the editor of that damn thing. This November will be 5 years since I've been the editor of the OC Weekly. Before that, I was a managing editor of the OC Weekly, so I was number 2. Before that, I was an investigative reporter for the OC Weekly, doing a lot of stuff on religion, on immigration, on corruption in North and Central Orange County. The longest job I've had, and that's what we're kind of going to talk about this today. I've been the food critic now for 15 years. When it comes down to questions about food in Southern California, when we get to the question part of this, if all you want to do is ask me questions about food, I'm more than happy. I am the king of Orange County food. I'm like Rain Man. If you ask me something, I'll ask it immediately. In Los Angeles, I leave that more to Jonathan Gold and Bill Esparza. They're the masters of Los Angeles, but I know a little bit as well. And it's cool to be here in Boyle Heights, actually, because my journalism career actually began here. I did an article in July, I just looked up right now, it's still there. In July of 2001, I did an article for the Jewish Journal of Greater Los Angeles about the Breed Street Shul, just right up the street. So I just drove by there and like, it looks nicer than when I was there 15 years ago, but it's still behind barbed wire. I hope eventually someone, somewhere, opens it up to the community again, because it's a beautiful building and it really just talks about what I think is one of the beautiful things about Boyle Heights, and which we'll talk about a little bit, is the history and the multiculturalism of all that. But what gets me the most notoriety nationwide is a column that I do called Ask a Mexican, which is exactly what it sounds like. People send me questions about Mexicans and I answer them. And the purpose of the column is to debunk and deconstruct stereotypes and misconceptions that people have about Mexicans. So any possible question you could think about Mexicans, I guarantee you I've answered. I've answered questions about history, about taxes, about drugs, tomatoes, the skull of Pancho Villa, gentification, midgets. No matter what you could possibly think about Mexicans, I've answered it. That's not what I'm going to talk about today. If when it comes to questions from ustedes, if you want to ask me questions about Mexicans, you're more than welcome to. But that's a whole other lecture. You're going to have to bring me for that for Cinco de Mayo or something. I don't know. But that column, I've been doing that column now for about 12 years. all over all over the country, obviously now online, all that good stuff. A couple other things that I do, let's see, every Monday you can hear me on KCRW 89.9 FM, Monday around, I want to say 6:40 or so, I do a commentary called the Orange County Live, where I explain Orange County to the rest of Southern California, because Orange County needs to be explained to the rest of Southern California. I've been doing that now almost 3 years. Before I was on KCRW, I was on KPCC on Airtalk with Larry Mantle for a long time, a good 10 years or so. You can hear me on Good Food with Evan Kleiman about once a month on Saturday mornings. I talk about Orange County restaurants. What else? Oh, books. I'm the author. Do you have any of the books here by any chance? If you could bring me Taco USA, that would be awesome. So I could read a little bit from it. I'm the author of 3 books. My first book was called Ask a Mexican. It was a compilation of some of my favorite questions I had ever done for Ask a Mexican. That was in 2007. My second book is called Orange County: A Personal History. It's half memoir of Orange County, California, the way we've influenced the rest of the United States for better or for worse. And half memoir of my family's own history. My family's back and forth migration between Anaheim and the state of Zacatecas. Any of you from Zacatecas here? No? Where are you guys? Where are y'all from? Chihuahua, Michoacán, Chilangos, de Puebla, a whole bunch of people. Yeah, most of the people from Zacatecas are there's some in East LA, but you have to get more to Montebello, Whittier, around there, and then you go on the other side, or up to 5 to Pacoima, Canoga Park and all that. But there's a lot of people from Zacatecas and Anaheim specifically. And then the third book, which we're kind of going to talk about today, Taco USA, How Mexican Food Conquered America. It's a history of Mexican food in the United States, the way the United States consumes Mexican food. So I don't talk about Mexican food in Mexico. I talk about Mexican food in the United States. So there, I like to answer questions, if you can't tell already, or I like to investigate. So there, I talk about all sorts of, whatever you could possibly think about Mexican food in this country, I answer it. So I talk about why is it that salsa has been out selling ketchup now for 22 years, ever since 1994. Why is it that there's more tequila now sold in the United States than there is Mexico? And now more mezcal is being sold by far in the United States than Mexico as well. I talk about the history of Taco Bell, the history of Doritos. Doritos were actually invented by a Mexican family in Disneyland in the 1950s, specifically from Anaheim. All sorts of things, here's some of my books. Yeah. But you don't have Ask a Mexican. Did someone steal it? No, seriously. Ask a Mexican, my librarian friends have told me, Ask a Mexican very often is stolen. Somebody, they like the question and answer format, and I steal it. What I tell people, I'm like, I actually wrote this in my column, please don't steal my book, especially from libraries. Libraries are so underfunded. If you want to steal my book, just email me and I'll send you a free copy. Like seriously, like I don't want libraries to be like.
What's your email?
Yeah, what's your email? I'm about to say where you can follow me on social media. So if you like anything I have to say today, you can follow me on social media. On Twitter, I'm at Gustavo Arellano. I tweeted just right now that I was going to be here in Boyle Heights. On Instagram, I'm Gustavo_Arellano. There I mostly post food photos, random crap, and all that. Facebook, you can find my Ask a Mexican column. Just type in Ask a Mexican, it'll pop up. And then from there, you can find my email and all that stuff. But anyways, so today, when Patty first asked me to come here, she's like, what do you want to talk about? I'm like, I don't know. Let's talk about taco trucks on every corner. That idiot Trump supporter who, like, Mexicano himself, immigrant himself, who said, if you allow too many Mexicans here, there's going to be taco trucks on every corner because, what did he say? Like, my people are like shifty or like something, like it was the most bizarre thing. So I'm like, let's talk about that. But then a couple of weeks ago, I actually did a panel in, of all places, Laurie's Prime Rib, very hoity-toity, old Los Angeles, Beverly Hills, Laurie's Prime Rib, and it was a banquet for Unión de Vecinos here in Boyle Heights, and then another awesome organization talking about gentrification issues out in Venice and the West Side. And so it was a panel about Boyle Heights gentrification in Beverly Hills.
I know.
Over prime rib, which to me I'm like, whoa, but it was a great conversation. I mean, obviously, the gentrification in Boyle Heights has been a huge issue this year. So then I'm like, let's talk about gentrification. But then on the way here to Boyle Heights, I got off the 5 freeway and I'm driving, and then I see one of my all-time favorite burrito stalls, Allen B's. So I'm like, I want to talk about food. So I'm actually, what we're going to do, we're going to talk about both. We're going to talk about, since this is Boyle Heights, this is a special place, this is a place of controversy, and more importantly, this is a place of great food. I want to talk a little bit just sort of the history of Mexican food in Los Angeles, geared more from downtown through the east side, through the real east side, not Silver Fake. Tie it in, talk about that history, but also tie in about developments about Mexican food today, because I think that also leads into some of the questions that's going on with gentrification. And then more importantly then, after that, if you have any questions, I want this to be, a conversation. I don't like dialogue. Dialogue's too pedantic for me. Let's have a conversation about things. So anyways, my book, Taco USA, How Mexican Food Conquered America, came out in 2012. Wasn't a bestseller, but it sold well. It sold well enough that it went through a couple of printings, and now you can find it on paperback. So if you order now you can find it used, probably for like $2. So find it used instead of buying the full price. I think Libros Schmibros has it, so rent it from here, rent it from the library. But the book itself is broken up into chapters because 2012, 2013, and I guess I'll talk about the genesis of the book. Why I decided to write this book. The idea for the book actually came from my agent, because agents are always wanting you to write books that'll sell well or whatever. So we were in New York City of all places, right after the publication of my second book, Orange County. We're talking about books, and then we're talking about books, and he actually at one point while we're talking, I start getting into this conversation because I had just had Haitian fried goat. So imagine birria pero no en su jugo, just birria but fried, with the consommé, with the drippings on the side, with garbanzos, and then with like pink rice, and then in a vinegar sauce. So I'm describing it to him, because again, I'm a food critic. And he's like, you're really into food, why don't you write a book about Mexican food? And I told him I wasn't interested because there's so many cookbooks on Mexican food. I mean, everyone's written a cookbook about Mexican food. Paula Deen, Rick Bayless, Bobby Flay, for crying out loud, Guy Fieri, it seems everyone has written books about Mexican food. But what people hadn't written up until my book was a full-fledged history of Mexican food in the United States. There had been books about Mexican food and history of Mexican food in Mexico for sure. There have been smaller studies about some things here and there, like El Cholo, the second oldest Mexican restaurant in the United States. They actually have a good book about its history, but nothing comprehensive. So as a reporter, I always like to do stories that no one is telling. So then once I started going into the research of this book, I quickly realized that there were so many myths about Mexican food that were easily provable to be false. Sorry, I'm a little bit marble-mouthed today. I bit myself on the tongue a couple days ago. So, but there's so many myths, so many half-legends, and I'm like, no, I want to tell the story. I want to tell all the heroes, tell all the unknown stories, and more importantly, give credit to where credit is due. Because a lot of things that I was also discovering is that, at least if you saw the few histories of Mexican food in this country, it was only white people. It was white people that invented Mexican food. It was Frito-Lay and what's the one? Patron, Patron, tequila, and like it was very, very limited. So I decided to do the book. I thought it turned out great. So the book itself, I'll give the short, the Cliff's Notes, for those older folks out there. The Cliff's Notes version of this book, as Taco USA is broken up into chapters, but each chapter corresponds to a theme, and each chapter corresponds to a decade. Because basically the history of Mexican food can be boiled down to this. Americans, and I'm talking about, gabachos, white folks, they find out about some sort of Mexican dish. Either they read about it, nowadays, you find it online, either they went to Mexico and they tried it, or they tried it here in the United States, or they heard about it somehow. And then once they hear about it, they need to get it. They need to find it some way, somehow. So either they cross a river or they cross the tracks, however, whatever metaphor you want to use, although many times it was literally that's what they did. They find a cookbook, and then they start cooking it, or they wait for a restaurateur to come to their area or somewhere where they could drive off, and then they start eating it. They start eating it, but more importantly, they start loving it. They start loving it, they start making it, they start demanding it. They want more and more and more until finally that dish becomes assimilated into the American diet, and the American consumer says, okay, this dish that I used to love, I don't like it anymore. I want something that's more authentic than that. And we always have questions about authenticity. Well, this idea about authenticity has been raging in the United States for 125 years. That's how long Mexican food has been an obsession in this country. Basically, as soon as Americans were able to eat Mexican food, that's what they've been doing. So it's gotten to the point where Mexican food in this country, I compare it to a 7-layer bean dip. You have this Mexican food here, then it gets pushed down when something more authentic gets in. Then it gets pushed down again, more authentic. So you have this big, huge, multi-layered thing. It's all Mexican food, except people at the thing at the bottom, most of us here in this room would say, that's not authentic, that's white people Mexican food. But when it first came into this country, it was completely Mexican food. So let's talk about the most quote-unquote whitewashed Mexican dishes. Hard shell tacos, nachos, burritos for some people, what else? Chile con carne, or just chili. What's up?
The tostada bowl.
The taco bowl, yeah, the taco salad. Oh God, we'll talk about that in a bit. All of that at one point was considered authentic, not just by white folks, mind you, but also by Mexicanos. Most of the times, the Mexicanos who introduced those dishes. So that's and it seems every decade there's a new trend in Mexican food that people start obsessing about it, Americans, and then onward and onward. And it's interesting to see, it's all played out in this book, and it's interesting to see just how that phenomenon goes again and again and again. But let's talk about the history of Mexican food in Los Angeles, because that's where it really matters, right? Yeah. Although, when I did a list, the 5 most important cities in the history of Mexican food in the United States, and Los Angeles was only number 2. Number 1, by far, is San Antonio. By far. I'm not going to argue for San Antonio right now, but let's just say when I said in San Antonio, those people gave me a standing ovation when I lectured in front of them, and I got a lot of hate letters from Houston because I put Dallas in number 5. Like, who cares about Houston, Dallas beef? Like, ellos que saben, right? But but what's interesting about sort of the history of Mexican food in the United States, and especially Los Angeles' role in it, is from the beginning of Mexican food's history in the United States up until 1950. By far, it was San Antonio who was doing all the innovations. Everything from nachos to fajita. Well, fajitas more in the 80s. Chile con carne, the very idea of the combo plate. We all know what the combo plate is. All of that and so much more came from San Antonio. That's all from San Antonio. But from the 1950s onward, all the big innovations in American food in this country, the majority of them have been from Los Angeles. So if you rank them side by side, San Antonio is higher than LA, but San Antonio's trajectory is starting to go there. It's still great Mexican food, don't get me wrong, but the last innovation they did was fajitas. And fajitas wasn't even San Antonio. That was popularized by Houston. So San Antonio, what was the last innovation they did? Nachos, yeah. That was in the 1950s. That was the last big thing San Antonio had. Ballpark nachos specifically. Really quick story. The person who made ballpark nachos a thing was the cousin of the first wife of Johnny Cash. I know, random thing. He was a San Antonio native. He actually made them popular at Arlington Stadium, for the home of the Texas Rangers. So that was the last big thing San Antonio gave the United States. And LA, gosh, what haven't we given them in the past 50 years? Everything from La Lonchera with King Taco, burritos through Allenby's and Lupe's number 2 and all that stuff really got popular first here in Los Angeles. Going out to Placita Olvera, taquitos and Olvera Street at Cielito Lindo. You have, of course, in its own way right now, guisados. You have even regional Mexican food, all the pambazos and all the carnitas, and birria, la comida de Michoacán, de Oaxaca, all that coming from LA. And we're still giving the United States, we're still telling the United States how to eat Mexican food now, which is really amazing. So, but actually I'll ask you guys, what was the first popular Mexican dish in Los Angeles? In other words, what was the first dish that made the gabachos go crazy for Mexican food?
What decade?
What?
What decade?
No, I'm talking about the 1880s. Yeah. What was the first thing that people went crazy over? You said?
I said burritos.
Not burritos.
Chile con carne?
Not chile con carne. That was San Antonio. That was San Antonio that gave chile con carne.
Mole?
Not mole. Although, did you see the recent article?
Yeah, don't get started.
Yeah, don't get started on that. So someone compared mole to a oil spill, and that's all I'll say. From a prominent organization, we'll talk trash on them later. But go on. So not mole. Mole is amazing, but not mole.
Enchiladas.
Not enchiladas. No, I love quesadillas, but no.
Not gorditas, right?
No, gorditas are even better than quesadillas, man. Ooh. ¿Qué más?
1880, you said?
1880s. Tamales, here we go. Tamales. So the first popular dish, a Mexican dish in Los Angeles was tamales. And it's hard to track when tamales first, I mean, obviously, well, no, let me take that back. Tamales have been part of Los Angeles as long as there's been, Mexicanos in LA. A tamal is one of the few dishes that fundamentally have not changed over 1,000 years. Like, fundamentally. I mean, of course, if you have pork or whatever, but if you just have a simple tamal with maybe some, indigenous vegetables in it, the basic preparation has not changed. But the first mention of tamales in American letters doesn't start until the 1870s, and it wasn't Los Angeles newspapers who were doing it. It was newspapers from back east. It was actually the Atlantic magazine. The Atlantic magazine had a correspondent here saying, like, you go to Los Angeles and San Francisco, and everyone is eating is tamales. Tamales are like a thing, and and then it's funny if you read those old dispatches, because if you've read literature of the 1870s, it's very florid, over the top, and imagine talking about Mexicans. So yeah, they're like tamales made by the descendants of Montezuma, toothsome theory depths of hell, like so florid, over the top, kind of crazy. But in Los Angeles, tamales were becoming a big thing. So much so that the ancestor of the loncheras was invented here, or first became popular here in Los Angeles, and that was the tamale wagon. And I apologize if I say tamale over tamal or tamales. I'm just going through how they were calling them back in the day. So the tamale wagon, basically it's exactly what it sounded. People or men would go on horse carts with a wagon. They'd go park in downtown, now downtown LA, right down from City Hall, that whole area, Broadway and Main Street, and they would just park their wagons right there and sell all night, from the evening all the way through the night. So all the controversies you hear about loncheras over the past couple of years, that they take money away from businesses, that their food is dirty, that they're tapping into electrical outlets and water, like that they leave a mess, that they only attract undesirables or hipsters. All of that's the exact same thing that people were saying about tamale wagons back in the 1880s and 1890s. No, absolutely true story. So I have a chapter in my book about that, and you compare and contrast. And the LA City Council, nowadays, of course, it's the supervisors more than the City Council out in East LA, but the LA City Council tried their damnedest to try to outlaw tamale wagons. And the great thing is that the eaters of tamales, they organize. Oh, someone's using Waze, I think. That's okay. They started organizing against the city council. So there were referendums passed, there were rallies for the tamaleros, and the tamaleros are mostly Mexicanos and Mexicanas. They would make them at home, then they would go and they would park. And it's interesting because unlike sort of some people call the gourmet food trucks, I call them Lux Loncheras because they're still loncheras. But instead of going all around town, they would just park in one spot and just stay, just like most loncheras, at least, most traditional loncheras do. And it was interesting, it became a huge phenomenon, became famous nationwide. The most famous lonchera, it was the most famous tamale wagon was a 2-story tamale wagon. I don't know, I've never found a picture of it, but, I read a description of it in the LA Times. They had the kitchen on the bottom, and then you'd climb up a ladder, and then you'd eat up on top. Wow. Like, a tamal with a view, I guess. But the LA City Council tried their damnedest to try to ban the tamale wagons, and they ultimately succeeded in banning them from downtown. But by then, there was a couple of things that were changing. First and foremost, you had automobiles now. So now you had people selling Mexican food, not just, they couldn't park anywhere anymore, but now it would be more like a delivery service. But another important thing happened, and that was the Mexican Revolution. So if you see, and this you can actually find online. I'm not sure Patty knows about it. The LA Public Library has a humongous collection of menus from Los Angeles, going back to like the 1880s, 1890s, huge, thousands of them. If you read a menu of Mexican food from the 1910s, you'll see some dishes that we know: enchiladas, chile rellenos, picadillo, chile colorado, chile verde. But what you won't see are tacos. You will not see tacos, and you will not see burritos. And the reason for that was because up until the Mexican Revolution, most of the Mexican migration here was very limited. It was from Sonora. It's because of that old Sonora immigration. That's why Southern California, more than other regions, loves its carne asada, loves its flour tortillas, and loves its chile colorado and all that, because those were all dishes coming from Sonora. After the Mexican Revolution, though, you have that whole migration of basically the taco belt of Mexico. Michoacan, Guanajuato, Jalisco, Zacatecas, all these regions where tacos are, people eat tacos, people eat corn tortillas. That's why we started getting menudo, birria, pozole. You can't find that in menus before the Mexican Revolution in LA. You could find them after because that's everything that came up. And so the earliest known taco recipe in English actually came from a cookbook from 1918 done by a white woman named Bertha Hafner Ginger. So even then, white people needed to get rich off of Mexican food. Like it's something that's always happened. But the story with her was she was a famous Midwestern chef, went around the country. LA Times in 1912 hired her to do cooking classes. Like, here's how to cook, French food. Here's how to cook a good pot roast. Here's how to cook, American food from the 1910s. Well, one day she starts walking down. The building no longer exists, but the street is basically on the parking lot. One of the big parking lots near to La Placita Olvera, like one of the big ones right there. I can't remember which one, but right, you know which one? Which is the one right across the street. Okay. Here's Cielito Lindo right here. Here's Chinatown right here. The big parking lot right here. So imagine it's now all parking lot. Used to be buildings. So one day Bertha Hafner Ginger is walking down, blah blah blah, whatever. She sees a tortilla factory right there, a tortilleria, and she starts literally looking through the window, and she sees women making tortillas, women making Mexican food. She had never had Mexican food before. She walks in, she starts eating this Mexican food, and she got so inspired by it that she started teaching classes about Mexican food. Those became, later on in her biography, those became by far the most popular classes she would offer. She started going around the United States offering classes on Mexican food, and eventually she authored a book called, it wasn't the first Mexican cookbook in English, those go back to the 1880s actually. She authored what's it called? California Spanish Mexican Cuisine, because remember, back in those days, you weren't called Mexican, you were called Spanish. And so that's the oldest known recipe for a taco that we have, and that's also the first documented photo of a taco. And this is very key because the recipe and the picture, it's a hard shell taco. So when people tell you that hard shell tacos are not Mexican, that's absolute bull. I mean, I grew up with them, tacos dorados. My mom would make them con papas during Cuaresma, but so who knows where she got that recipe from, but that's what we know. The first known taco in the United States was hard shell, and it was basically created here in Los Angeles. But the first famous taco was the taquitos of Olvera Street. So tacos weren't really sold across the United States until the 1930s, and the first popular ones were the taquitos. And we've all had these taquitos, right? At this point, you better have. If not, let me describe it to you. So they fry them fresh every morning. I think they go through 3,000 a day. They make them all natural, whatever. Inside it's barbacoa, so it's basically barbecued beef or pork, or it's beef. They have this really weird avocado salsa. It almost looks like running guacamole, but don't think it's not. No te va a picar, si te pica. So they've been making those since 1931. And she got that recipe, or the family, it was Aurora Guerrero. Aurora Guerrero was her name, from Zacatecas, so those Zacatecas. She brought that recipe directly from Zacatecas. That was the food that she grew up with. So whenever people tell you, taquito or taquitos, that's not real Mexican food or whatever. No, it absolutely is. When it came to this country, it was absolutely real Mexican food.
Or flautas.
Or flautas. Flautas, dude, when my mom calls them flautas, she makes them with flour tortillas. There's a differentiation, which I never got. But yeah, taquitos. I mean, that's what they call them, taquitos. So that taquito then started getting spread around Los Angeles, started getting copied again and again and again, then started spreading nationwide. So that's already, we had 1880s, 1890s with the tamale wagons. 1910s with the first introduction of tacos. 1920s and 30s, you started getting the taquitos going around. 1940s, there's no real innovation, so to speak, about Mexican food, but we also have something very key. You have a lot of servicemen during World War II coming through California, through Southern California. Most infamously, of course, during the Zoot Suit riots, when a whole bunch of good old boys started beating up on Pachucos. But also, you had all these people from the southwest, from the south, from the east, going through El Toro, going through what used to be in Chavez Ravine and all that. Once they were off base, they wanted to eat food, so they would go to Mexican restaurants, and they started eating a lot of Mexican food. When they would go off to the war front, usually to the Pacific Theater, they wanted their Mexican food. They got hooked on it so much that the Army and Navy and Marines, they all started switching their rations so they could get like some beans and rice or maybe some Tabasco, like what they thought was Mexican food. After World War II, a lot of these servicemen, with that taste in Mexican food, they started going across the United States and opening their own Mexican restaurant chains. That's where, and that's exactly what happened with Taco Bell. We all hate Taco Bell, and I think we should hate Taco Bell. Del Taco's way better anyway, if you want to go down that route. But the story with Taco Bell was you had, I think he was Marines. It was Glenn Bell. He was on kitchen patrol. He was in the kitchen. He was originally from Long Beach, but moved after the war to San Bernardino. When he goes to San Bernardino, he's like, I need to become a millionaire. I want to become rich. Because he grew up, his family was rich, but his dad was a drunk, so he grew up poor. So he goes to San Bernardino, he's like, I need to become rich. I'm going to do it through Mexican food. He couldn't do it through hamburgers anymore because late 1940s you have the McDonald brothers becoming millionaires making hamburgers. So he decides to open up a little hamburger and hot dog stand on the west side of San Bernardino. If you know anything about San Bernardino, that's the barrio, the west side of San Bernardino. On the corner of Mount Vernon and 6th. Mount Vernon was now called Mount Vernon, but those days it was Route 66. So he knew that there was going to be all these people coming in, but he didn't know how to make tacos, so he decided to steal a recipe. So right across the street from his little stall, it was called Bell's Burgers, was a Mexican restaurant. So every night after he'd close, he'd go right across the street, get the tacos, go back, try to reverse engineer them. He did that so much that eventually the owner, one day he goes to him and says, look, I know you're trying to steal my recipe. But instead of you stealing it and doing a bad job, why don't you just come back with me to the kitchen and I'll show you how to do the recipe. So Glenn Bell does that, of course. The rest, as we know, is history. Don't think I made this up. Glenn Bell admits this all in his book. Awesome title, don't get it from the library. Taco Titan, the Glenn Bell story. And he has a big old sombrero on the cover and all that. He admits it. He flat out says, I stole this recipe. What annoyed me, though, in doing my research was that he never named the restaurant. Because you might, if you're going to rip someone off, at least give them their due. So in doing the research for the book, I was able to discover what the name of the restaurant was. 90% of restaurants close within a decade. So when I finally found the address, I thought to myself, well, let me go out there. I'm sure it's no longer there, but I could at least see the building and write this really dramatic scene or something. But no, the restaurant's still there. Meat La Cafe. It's the oldest Mexican restaurant in the Inland Empire. It's next year, actually it's going to celebrate its 80th birthday. So it's been open since 1937. And the tacos, that taco that Glenn Bell stole, they have never changed the recipe since the owners came from Jalisco. And the recipe, guess what? It's a hard shell taco. Hard shell taco, ground beef, now they mix it up with potato, but ground beef, yellow cheese, then and then you have the shredded lettuce and then the tomatoes. That recipe has never changed. So I was proud to be able to tell that story in my book. And the great thing, after my book came out, that they got all this attention. New York Times, CNN, it's gotten a lot of press. And so one of my favorite parts in the book was I interviewed the daughter-in-law of the founders, Irene. Even though I call her Irma here, her real name's Irene. Irene Montaño. Old feisty lady, late 70s. So I went to her and I asked her oh yeah, is it true that Glenn Bell stole your family's recipe? She's like, oh yeah, I remember him. He used to come here all the time. We'd make fun of him because he's a white guy trying to make Mexican food, ha 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 ha. And I'm like, well, don't you guys feel bad that Glenn Bell was able to create a multi-billion-dollar empire based on your family's recipe? And she's like, good for him. He's been around for 50-some years? We've been around for, at that point, 75 years. And besides, our tacos are better. So, to me, I thought that was very cool of her. I mean, they could have been billionaires, but whatever. That didn't happen. But, okay, so that's all. Now that's the 1950s. Tacos now start spreading all across the United States, the hard shell taco. But again, remember, Americans, They loved them, but then they're like, well, there has to be something better than hard-shell tacos. And then that came with, East LA's own King Taco. And the East LA, and the story was, and, I'm paraphrasing here, but it's all in my book. What was it, 1970 or 1971? The founder of King Taco, what's his name? Last name is Rodriguez. What's his first name? Was it Mario? I'm gonna find it. Why not? But anyways, let's see. Did I put it in the index? King Taco, because I should have. Something called Miracle Tortilla. Si no, ahorita lo encuentro. King Taco, 164. Because give credit where credit's due, right? Yeah. Don't tell my story, please. Teasing. No, you're right. Absolutely right.
While you're looking at it.
Su nombre es Raúl Martínez. So Raúl Martínez, 1974, Chilango, he would make tacos at soccer matches, soccer games, whatever. But the tacos he was making was not the hard-shell tacos. Those are tacos that people in Mexico at that point were eating. What they used to call soft tacos, but now we just call tacos, corn tortilla with meat inside, you eat it. So he decides to buy an old ice cream truck and park it on Olympic Boulevard at night. And his friends are like, you're crazy. No one is ever going to buy tacos a la lonchera, which to me, I find that an interesting story because lunch truck culture was already embedded in Southern California. I mean, after the tamale wagons, by the 1930s and 40s and 50s, you have food trucks all over Southern California going to like workplaces, selling, cold sandwiches, some tamales still, or delivering bread. Of course, Helm's Bakery being the most famous one for those of you who remember, all that stuff. So food trucks were a known commodity, but I guess it wasn't a known commodity in the Mexican community. But to me, it's interesting how quickly we forget and how what we think is new is actually old. So these loncheras, the tamale wagons were being, that they beat them on that. But Raúl parked it on Olympic Boulevard and from there created the empire. We all know the story of King Taco, of course, amazing. To me, the sad part about the King Taco story is that that original ice cream lonchera got lost in a fire in the 80s. They didn't keep a single part of it. It would have been cool if you go to like a King Taco, they just have a hubcap there and said, this was from the original King Taco.
Yeah.
It was historic. No one had ever sold just tacos off of lonchera until King Taco, until Raúl Martínez did. So absolutely historic. I'll always love King Taco. I know some people like to talk trash and they're like, the food quality sucked or whatever. I've always liked that salsa. That salsa is like, I don't know what they do with it. And I personally like the sopes more than the tacos or the burritos, but I'll always have respect for King Taco. Anyway, so that's 1970s. 1970s, you start seeing all the, lonchera start spreading, going to the 80s or whatever. 1980s, you start seeing a new style. Oh, we forgot about burritos. Really quickly on burritos, of course, you have one of the icons here, Manny's El Tepeyac, Allen B's, and whatever. What's interesting about burritos is that no one exactly knows where they were invented or why they got the name of the burrito. Just, como se dice, logical deduction will put it in northern Mexico because that's where flour tortillas are from. That's where you have, that's where people are used to that tradition of wrapping stuff in a flour tortilla instead of a corn tortilla. Some people say Sonora, some people say Juarez, some people say Tucson, somewhere along in the borderlands. What we do know, the first recipe for a burrito was actually made in New Mexico. It was by a white woman named, librarian actually, Erna Ferguson. No, she was a legend. She was Erna Ferguson. There's a library branch named after her there. Erna Ferguson wrote a book about New Mexican food with the first known recipe for a burrito. And it's interesting because that first recipe, it was what they call a smothered burrito, but we call them a wet burrito. So just covered in a salsa. So she makes it burrito, but the first, ¿cómo se dice? The first large-scale consumers of burritos were not people buying them, but braceros. So we all know the bracero program. The bracero program, of course, was back when the United States and Mexico kind of liked each other. The United States and Mexican governments, they got into an agreement where there would be legal migration by men and a couple of women, but mostly men, so they could pick crops, they could stay here for a couple of years, and they'd be sent back to Mexico. Well, what was interesting in my research was that the farmers, they tried to pretend that they were humane, and so they thought, okay, we'll give them Mexican food, but let's try to think of the cheapest Mexican food possible. So let's get beans and rice and let's put them in flour tortillas and burritos. And Mexicans only eat Mexican food. Burritos are Mexican food, right? But if you read the annals of braceros, they hated those burritos because a lot of those braceros were coming from central and mostly central Mexico. They didn't know what burritos was. My mom, the first time she ever had a flour tortilla was when she came to the United States in the 1960s. The first time she had a burrito was in the 1960s, and she's from Zacatecas, which is like central northern Mexico. Now, none of those people had it. But the burrito then became a little bit more recognizable in the 1950s, not just with the burrito chains, not just with Taco Bell and Del Taco, they all sold those burritos, but also your Manny's El Tepeyac, Allenby's, Lucy's Drive-In, all these different places in Southern California start spreading the burrito. So if you want to know what the original burrito was, it wasn't the Chipotle burrito. The Chipotle burrito is it's more of a San Francisco tradition anyway. It's not the burrito, what they call the California burrito with the French fries and that's more San Diego. The oldest burritos is basically what you get at Allenby's. Beans, cheese, and sauce. That was it. And not humongous, they were small. So I always tell people, not here, because here we have all sorts of burrito options, but outside of Los Angeles, I tell them, if you want to eat the original burritos, the people who make them still is Del Taco. They're half-pound bean and cheese for $1.08. That's how much I buy them, that I know how much it costs with tax. That is the original burrito. So that's another innovation LA gave, Mexican innovation gave to the world. Really quickly then, 1980s, that's when you start seeing new migration to Southern California, Mexican migration to Southern California, but instead of dropping most of their Mexican culture like previous generations, those immigrants started bringing in their style of foods. Now that's when you start getting regional Mexican cuisine. Because, nothing against birria or menudo, but it's eaten by a lot of Mexicans from a lot of different states. I'm talking about like pambazos from Mexico City. I'm talking about aguachile from Sinaloa. I'm talking about, of course, ¿qué más? Huaraches, they're kind of a known commodity, but I'm talking about like alambres from Cuernavaca. I'm talking about mole negro from Oaxaca. Very specific dishes to regions, to states that start coming up because you have entire populations that had never come to the United States before coming up here. So I devote a whole chapter to the family that created Guelaguetza. Guelaguetza, very famous Oaxacan restaurant, now very famous mezcaleria too. They weren't the first people to make Oaxacan food in the United States, but they're the ones who made it mainstream. They're the ones who got all the attention. And to me, the most telling story was the one they told me was, so the father is Fernando Lopez is his name. So Fernando, when I interviewed him, he told me that when he first opened up Guelaguetza, he was only getting two types of consumers. He was getting Oaxaqueños who wanted a taste of their homeland, and he was getting rich people from the west side. Because what ended up happening was you had all these, because if you know your Southern California history, Oaxacans didn't come to East Los Angeles or Boyle Heights, or they tried to, but all the Mexicans here were discriminated against them. Pinche Oaxaqueño, sorry kid, sorry. Indio, all of that stuff. So where did they end up? The west side, like Pacific Palisades, Santa Monica, Venice, it's sad to say, but as far away from Mexicans as possible. So they ended up working as nannies, as gardeners, or whatever. So what ended up happening is they'd go to Guelaguetza, buy the food, give it to their bosses, and say, oh, look, this is part of my cuisine. So Fernando was telling me that he'd be bewildered on a Saturday or Sunday morning, because his original Guelaguetza was in Koreatown. Like, what was it? Like, I think it was 8th Street, thank you, 8th Street, right there in, kind of a, working class area, Koreatown, and he'd be bewildered because there was a whole line of Audis, Lexuses, Mitsubishis, like fancy cars. It's like, what are these gabachos doing here, coming in here? Regular white people, like non-rich white people from the west side were coming in to try his food because they didn't know what Oaxacan food was. And Mexicans weren't trying that Oaxacan food because for them it was dirty. It was beneath them. It was Indio food. Very tellingly, La Opinión didn't publish their first article about Guelaguetza until 1998. By then, there had been articles in Martha Stewart, the New York Times, Bon Appetit. There had been television segments. La Opinión was supposed to be the big champion of Mexican food. No, because for them, it was Oaxacan food. But now, thankfully, we're in an era where at least there's not that much animosity between Mexican groups or whatever. But so I credit the Lopez family. And onward, of course, the big trend last decade, at the end of last decade, well, I would say in the past 10 years, were all those Lux Loncheras, those fancy food trucks, the hipster food trucks. That was created by Roy Choi. Roy Choi, actually Korean guy from Orange County, but set up here in Los Angeles. became super popular, you had all these other things. Now we're going through a new rise in Mexican food, which some people are calling Alta California cuisine, some people call it Pocho cuisine, some people call it Mexican American cuisine, whatever you want to call it, try it. And this is basically Mexican food being created by Mexican Americans, the children of Mexican immigrants who grew up just like a lot of us here, but they went to cooking school, they went to culinary school, they have fancy traditions, so now they come back and they want to elevate, well, in their words, elevate Mexican cuisine, but more importantly, they want to do Mexican food according to their traditions. They know that they're not going to match the food of their family, of their parents, or the food of the immigrants, because they're not immigrants. They want to combine all this style of food. So the people that are doing it right now, Ray Garcia and Broken Spanish in downtown LA, you have Wes Avila, Guerrilla Tacos, you have Guisados to a certain extent, although Guisados is, I love Guisados, that place, I really do, but that style of food, Guisados, that's actually more from El Paso and Juarez right there, because there they have Guisados like on a buffet. It's totally cool. You have Carlos Salgado down in Taco Maria, really amazing food, but not without its controversy. La Monarca Bakery, which is right down the street, even though they just sell pan dulces, they're representing a different level of Mexican food. And so the controversy now, how it ties into gentrification, is this idea that, at least the criticism that people have against those types of restaurants is like, oh, you're charging $15 for a taco. Mexican food should be cheap. Mexican food should be accessible to the working classes and all of that. And I totally get those arguments.